It's 11 o'clock here. So I wanted to thank everybody for joining us today. This is the third webinar conversation we've had as we try and help the community navigate the various issues associated with our new norm dealing with the coronavirus, and especially for the childhood cancer community, parents and caregivers that are anxious and scared and wondering about issues associated with going to the hospital for treatment, enrolling in clinical trials, staying on clinical trials. All of these various issues are new, but I'm thrilled to be joined by Ira Dunkel. Dr. Dunkel is with Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center and the Pediatric Brain Tumor Consortium. I first met Dr. Dunkel back in 2010 when my daughter, who had DIPG, was on a clinical trial up at Memorial Sloan Kettering for about 6 months, somewhere around there. I traveled with my daughter to New York City every single week. And now I work with Dr. Dunkel on the NCI Brain Malignancy Steering Committee. Dr. Dunkel is a very, very calming voice, I find. And so with all of the stress and anxiety associated with parents and caregivers having to deal with navigating these issues, this is an important conversation. So first and foremost, thank you, Ira, for joining us today.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for having me. And I'm certainly happy to be here and to try to help and answer any questions.
Well, we appreciate it. And another thing that I will say right up front is that this is not a conversation for medical advice and for purposes of receiving medical advice. If you have a child in treatment, if there's any questions that are specific to your child and their treatment, please address them with their treatment team. Or if you're seeking a second opinion, there's ways to do that. This is not the forum for that. We just wanted to have a discussion about the issues within institutions, making sure that kids stay on treatment, making sure that they can access treatment, making changements so that parents don't have to fear continuing on treatment, as well as talking about clinical trials and the effect and impact there as well. So being at Memorial Sloan Kettering, how is this affecting what you have to do in terms of patient treatment, and how is it affecting your daily life?
Sure, and maybe before I answer that question, I'll just introduce myself briefly to the group.
I'm a horrible host.
So to everyone out there, I'm a pediatric neuro-oncologist at Memorial Sloan Kettering. I primarily care for and conduct clinical research with children, teenagers, young adults with brain tumors and eye tumors. And sort of my other role in the pediatric oncology community is that I'm chair of a group called the Pediatric Brain Tumor Consortium, which is an NCI sponsored phase 1 and phase 2 clinical trial consortium. So I think as we have our conversation this morning, and as I answer, I'll answer partially, from my personal perspective, but also I'm frequently, almost every day, speaking to colleagues at other major medical centers and the NCI and the FDA and the CIRB. So I'll sort of give you the bigger perspective also from all this.
Thank you. I should have given you that opportunity to introduce yourself. I figured, well, I know you and we have your bio out there, but I think that helps a lot to frame the conversation.
I'm sorry, Jonathan. So going back to the question that you posed, how are things going?
Yeah, so we all see the images and read the stories about how badly hit New York City is, and Sloan Kettering is obviously a very large treatment center for children with cancer. How is the current situation impacting your daily life as a provider?
Sure. So Obviously, in New York, like, almost everywhere, life is very different now than it was a few weeks ago. But I am happy to say that from the perspective of a pediatric oncologist caring for our patients and our families, that I think that things are continuing to go well, and that we really are able to provide the essential care that our patients and their families need.
Okay. Are you having to change your routine in terms of when you do go to the clinic and go to the hospital and interact with families and patients? Has anything changed logistically for you?
Sure. For me personally, things have changed a little bit in that under normal circumstances, I would be in clinic every Monday and see many patients, and other colleagues would cover clinic on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, etc. And we're now having one pediatric neuro-oncology doctor cover clinic for a week at a time, and then having other people working remotely.
Got it. And are you providing any type of guidance to families that are still coming to clinic in terms of what they can expect and what extra caution based advice that they can receive so that they're safer or being safe?
Yeah, so there's really a huge amount of communication before the visit and, at the time when patients are coming to the hospital to try to maintain everybody's safety. So certainly we are, of course, doing everything you would expect about communicating with families to make sure that they are not having a febrile respiratory illness, and if they are, of course, taking extra precautions. But with everybody, we're taking precautions at this point. And I think that one of the things that we, and not really Memorial Sloan Kettering specifically, but all of us in the community are doing is really trying to think carefully about what are medical services that are essential and require the families and their children to come to the hospital, what can be done remotely. And certainly we are having lots of telephone visits with families rather than in-person visits. What services are things that are not essential at this point in time? Is there some sort of visit or scan or something that we had scheduled but really could easily be postponed for an interval without putting the patient at risk? And then we are certainly, rescheduling things to require families to go to the hospital only when it's really essential for the welfare of their child.
That was going to be one of the topics that I wanted to discuss with you, was the role of telemedicine and how that is being utilized, across the field with patients to ensure that they don't have to travel for non-essential, visits and things like that. So it's good to hear that that's being used. Do you know whether that's being used in a widespread fashion in the community at other institutions?
Yeah, definitely. Colleagues I've spoken to at other hospitals have told me that they are doing consultations or interacting with existing patients via telephone, at least. I don't know how often it's being done via formal telemedicine versus telephone, but the idea that major medical centers are embracing, communicating with their patients or possible new patients remotely rather than on site, I think has definitely become common recently.
Yeah, it makes sense, obviously, sparing people the need to, make the trip in if necessary. And are there any current recommendations in terms of travel to trial sites and treatment sites for people that don't necessarily, that would have to travel to access treatment? Are there any guidelines that are being put out to families?
So I think that for patients who are currently participating on a clinical trial, for example, through PBTC, we at PBTC and in collaboration with discussions with the National Cancer Institute and the Food and Drug Administration and individual hospitals are, trying to be very reasonable and appropriate. And what I mean by that is, under normal circumstances, clinical trial participants really need to be at the hospital where the clinical trial is being run on a very fixed schedule with limited flexibility, as to what can happen. And I think that all of us realize that with the current circumstances, that's just not possible in many cases. So at PBTC, we are certainly allowing the doctors and the patients to have some of these visits done remotely via phone calls rather than in person. We are allowing certain things, blood tests or scans or things that may be necessary to be done locally rather than at the PBTC hospital site, if that's better for the patient. So we definitely are trying to introduce a little bit more flexibility into this to make things safer for the patients and their families.
I mean, that's great to hear, because it's obviously, this is all anybody is thinking about. And then, for these families that are still accessing treatment and on treatment, the anxiety and the fear is that much greater at this point. So, I'm glad to hear that there's so much more flexibility being discussed and considered, and that hopefully eases some of that anxiety. What prompted me reaching out to you was several articles that I saw talking about kids that might not be able to access treatments or haven't been able to access treatments for one reason or another. Have you heard much, if any, of that from talking to colleagues and in your day-to-day practice?
I'm happy to say, honestly, that so far I am not personally aware of a child who couldn't access essential care because of what's going on. Now, of course, there may be things elsewhere that I'm not familiar with, but at least, in my colleagues at Memorial or doctors at hospitals that I work with regularly, I've not heard that be the case. Now, of course, I also don't want to, deny the reality. I mean, of course, life is very different, and there are reasons why patients may not be able to make it to the hospital because they're unwell or things like that. But I'm not, thankfully, aware that any care that was really essential for the health of the child has not been able to be administered. And this is a little bit off topic, but maybe I could say also, Jonathan, to you and to the people listening, that at least specifically in the pediatric brain tumor community, which is where I, work, but I'm sure it's true for the pediatric leukemia doctors and sarcoma doctors and others as well. I mean, thankfully, we really are a close-knit collegial professional community. And even under normal circumstances, I think we work together well and really try hard to do things for the best of our patients and families. And I think, in these very unusual circumstances that we're dealing with now, that we're even trying harder, to do that and to work together and to make sure that if we have patients from far away, but who could access care, someplace more convenient for them, we're certainly recommending to them that they reach out to our colleague at a closer center rather than traveling from far away to New York, given the special circumstances.
Yeah, and that's something I've always found in this community, and my daughter had DIPG, obviously, which, not obviously, some of the people that are listening don't know that, but DIPG is a terminal brain tumor, and being in this community, I've always found that the researchers and clinicians are very collegial in general and work together. So I can only imagine that at this time that you're being, I was going to use the word forced, but that's not the right word choice, but that it's creating even greater need to work together to ensure that your patients are able to access treatment and can shift as things shift. So that's good to hear.
Yeah, and I mean, of course, I imagine that, people on this webinar, are feeling enormous anxiety about their child in general, even pre-COVID. And I just do want to reassure everybody that, the pediatric oncologists, neuro-oncologists really are extremely aware of what you're dealing with and are really, trying to do everything possible to maintain the care that your child needs. And as I said earlier, I'm not familiar with patients not being able to receive essential care at this moment.
That's good. I mean, that's good to hear. You've talked about the FDA, and before I move on to this question and kind of follow up with something you said, I just want to let people know that if you do want to ask a question, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of the webinar screen. Again, it's not for purposes of medical advice. If you have a specific question with respect to your child's treatment regimen or what treatment they're on, those should be addressed to your care team. If you have questions with respect to, advice as to, how to take advantage of some of these other, opportunities to communicate with your care providers and via Zoom or telemedicine settings, and how to access treatment in that fashion. This is what this is about. And mainly, I just wanted to have a discussion that hopefully provides some comfort to the community. But we'll take questions at the end today, and please submit them, and we'll try and get to everybody's questions. If we can't, you can email me at jonathan@maxcure.org, and we'll try and answer questions as they come in. With regards to the FDA, have they issued any guidance with respect to trial participation and treatment continuity? And if they have, can you go into a little bit more detail about any type of guidance being issued by the FDA at this point?
Sure. So kind of speaking, wearing my PBTC hat now, as this has been developing, we've had very frequent communication with kind of all the relevant parties, not just the FDA, but the National Cancer Institute and the Central IRB of the National Cancer Institute, who oversee most of our trials, various pharmaceutical company partners that we work with who are providing investigational study drugs for our patients. So I would say communication has actually been extremely good with the various parties, and that the general take-home message has been that everybody has been very reasonable and understands that there are limitations on our ability to comply with things that we would normally do, and have really given us permission to temporarily alter some of the stringency or limits of what we normally do. So as I was saying earlier, we are able to do some things remotely with the patients, whether they're visits or laboratory values or scans. We're able to some degree, in at least some circumstances, to ship drugs to patients rather than to require them to come pick them up from the hospital, as which would often be the case. So we really are, I think, being treated very fairly and reasonably by all these stakeholders, and everybody really is working hard together to try to make it possible for the studies to continue to provide the treatment for the child that the parents and the doctors think the child would benefit from, but also to try to maintain the integrity of the study and to try to capture all the essential data that we need to try to figure out, are these drugs beneficial and safe, and, the various important things that we set out to try to do.
Yeah, that's another concern that I have heard and that I have in terms of clinical trial initiation, data interpretation, moving from phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and trying to maintain momentum in the research community and the clinical community to not lose ground with so much of the effort that has been underway to create therapies and gain approval for therapies, and so that's something that I'm curious about. Are there new trials that are accruing at this point, and how is that being handled?
Right. So, of course, that's a very reasonable concern. How may this impact, the whole clinical trial infrastructure? Up till now, again at PBTC, we are still moving ahead with developing and opening new trials, conducting our existing trials. A lot of the work that goes into this was already, sort of being done remotely. The research teams putting together the research plans, the submission of the protocols to the National Cancer Institute and the FDA and the CIRB, all of that is still going on. And up till now, I think things are continuing to move ahead kind of in a timely fashion, and we really haven't had major obstacles to doing, what we would like to do. We've reached out to the pharmaceutical companies that we're working with to make sure from their perspective that they're able to produce the drug, they're able to ship the drug to the hospitals. And so far, we've gotten reassuring feedback from them that things can move forward. So, I can imagine that there will be moments where things come up that will impact on the conduct of existing or new trials. But so far, we have been able to move forward, I think, pretty well.
Do you see that continuing?
You know, I hope so. Of course, what we're dealing with is so fluid and dynamic that we don't know what's coming exactly. So you can imagine different scenarios where there could be obstacles that come up. So I don't really know how to predict the future, but at least for the moment, I think things are still functioning pretty well.
Got it. Okay. And as you know, as you just said, it's obviously a very fluid situation, and you know, things could change today. They could change tomorrow in terms of what the states are doing, what the federal government's doing, what we're being told to do. You know, what's being done to ensure that the continuity of data that's being aggregated from these trials is going to continue to a level that allows for you know, the trials to progress if they go past phase 1 or phase 2.
Yeah, I think, of course, that's a major concern that we have. I mean, of course, the primary concern is the safety and well-being of the patients, but you know, an important secondary concern is that we want to get the information out of the trial that we need to really figure out, are these beneficial new treatments, safe new treatments for our patients, and if so, you know, to move them to the next stage in the study development. So we are having lots of internal discussions about that, and I think so far we're pretty confident that we're able to continue to obtain the mandatory data that we need to answer the questions from the study. I'm sure there will be data that, you know, ideally we would collect that we can't collect because certain tests couldn't be done in the right time frame and things like that. But so far, we're cautiously optimistic that we're still going to be able to conduct the trials to, you know, the necessary high quality that will be able to answer the questions that we pose.
Are you seeing any delays in terms of, and I know this is a very new situation in some respects, but are you seeing delays from IRBs in terms of opening up clinical trials at this point in time?
So far, things are still working well there. And I hope it will continue to, because a lot of that work, I mean, you know, when we have these types of meetings under normal circumstances, most of this is taking place in face-to-face meetings, although even in normal circumstances, there are ability for people who can't be present to phone into research review meetings and IRBs and things like that. Obviously, you know, recently and for the foreseeable future, they're not going to be taking place face-to-face, and we're going to be using Zoom and WebEx and telephone to do it. But thankfully, we really can do that kind of work remotely well. So far that hasn't been a problem, that IRBs and other important committees have been able to function and review things to the normal level of quality required, and things are moving forward well.
Good, and that's good to hear, because that was another concern that I had in terms of any potential delays that were going to be experienced in terms of initiating clinical trials, given, you know, current circumstances. So I wanted to thank Jason Shohei for passing on something that I had not seen. He said, hot off the press, early advice on managing children with cancer during COVID-19 pandemic. Call for sharing experiences. Eric Buffet, a number of other folks. SciUp published statement today. I haven't seen it. I don't. Have you seen it, Dr. Dunkel?
I haven't read this yet.
Okay. Yeah, it'll be interesting to look at that. We do have one question so far, and this was something that I was going to touch on here momentarily, but with the question pending, it's a good segue into that. So, kids accessing treatment in the States from overseas is always something that is difficult in general on some levels, but the question is, what's your view on the viability of children continuing to access clinical trials at various clinical centers like Sloan Kettering and other PBTC trials, things like that, and are there any discussions with respect to opportunities for institutions to gain medical permission for travel and to keep children being eligible to seek treatment?
Obviously, it's a very big question. And it probably, the answer is going to, vary from, location to location where the patients are coming from and travel restrictions. And, some of those are probably beyond my expertise to answer. I think that for patients who can come to PBTC sites, who there's a compelling reason to believe that a clinical trial option that we have could help the child, that we are continuing to work very hard to make it possible for the child to access the care, and whether the child can safely travel or will be allowed to travel from overseas into the United States or from another state to a PBTC site. Of course, that we'd have to look at every, specific situation and answer that, probably differently. But I think that from the PBTC perspective, we're trying to continue to offer these options for the patients.
And obviously things are out of your control from the standpoint of travel restrictions and, a lot of other guidelines which are outside of your realm. So, it's a individual by individual basis, whether or not they can maintain treatment domestically here in the U.S. or travel to enroll in a trial. So, it's certainly a fluid situation, as you've said. In terms of the underlying research, with it, how is the day-to-day preclinical research being impacted? And by preclinical, I'm talking about in the laboratory, not in patients, not in children. So, using mice and using other, laboratory methods, how is that impacted at this point?
Yeah, I think their COVID is definitely having a hopefully short-term impact, in that the major medical centers where I speak to colleagues, of course, the clinical services are open to provide the care for the patients, but I think most, or perhaps all, of these major medical centers really have cut back on non-essential urgent patient care work, and that laboratories are, temporarily being closed down, or at least, being on very, very minimal staff maintaining the research. So unfortunately, it is true, I think, that on my clinical research, which is proceeding, that the basic science research is temporarily more impacted by the restrictions.
Do you think we're going to see some type of gap in terms of new trials that are being written and initiated as a result of this impact?
Well, I think the good news I can share with you and the other people on the call is that at PBTC, we continue to have many new clinical trial proposals coming in. We continue to have many new ideas being floated as ideas that doctors and scientists would like to propose. So, you know, it is true, of course, that if there would be a new laboratory discovery, if only the experiment could continue this week, that can't continue, that there's some theoretical risk of an impact. But I think based on work that, you know, has been ongoing and been done, that we are continuing to receive proposals that for the foreseeable future, you know, should keep us well able to offer new trials that have promise to our patients.
Okay. And that's good to hear. You know, as you were talking about the impact to the preclinical side of things, you know, I had this picture in my mind of, you know, all of the great work that's being funded in the laboratory, and then this gap because people aren't able to, you know, access their laboratories and you know, and so that's obviously a concern, especially in areas like pediatric brain tumors where, you know, there's such a desperate need for new promising trials, you know, especially in brain tumors like DIPG. You know, the community gets very excited when there is a new trial out there. So, you know, I'm glad to hear that you know, you don't think there's going to be that big of an impact. But, you know, obviously nobody knows, but, you know, that's reassuring.
Yes, I mean, I think, of course, you know, the million-dollar question is how long is this going to impact on all this laboratory, you know, infrastructure. So I don't see this being a short-term issue for us, and hopefully the labs will be able to get back to work, you know, in the reasonably near future. But obviously your concern is appropriate too.
Yeah, and again, you know, as we've said, it's such a fluid situation and things are changing, and you know, we all see the reports that within the next week to 2 weeks, we're expecting things to get worse from the standpoint of you know, people being diagnosed with COVID and people succumbing to the illness. And so, you know, I think you know, our anxieties are ramping up, and this is our population. Pediatric cancer population is you know, one that is being impacted significantly, and this is something we discussed with Dr. Ani, who himself is a childhood cancer survivor. You know, he's been at home for now 4 weeks, somewhere on there, give or take, because of the concerns of his own compromised health from the drugs that he took. He's a survivor of Hodgkin's lymphoma. And, you know, one of the things that I found reassuring about what he said, and this will segue into my next question, is, you know, he said that in a lot of ways, the advice that parents and caregivers are being given now in terms of how to protect their children really hasn't changed dramatically from what parents and caregivers had to do beforehand with children who might be immunocompromised, immunosuppressed. You know, we have to be extra cautious. So are you giving your patients any specific guidelines or guidance in terms of what they should be doing now before they come into the clinic versus before this entire pandemic began?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point that you and the doctor made, that although obviously this is very new situation for all of us. It's in some ways overlaps with things we were already doing. So our patients getting chemotherapy and steroids and bone marrow transplant were already susceptible to respiratory viruses, and we weren't worried about COVID, but we were worried about influenza and parainfluenza and RSV. So we were already giving the families advice that's sensible for COVID, also about monitoring their children closely to make sure if they're febrile or having other signs of an infection, to contact their medical team right away, to be very good about hand washing and things that obviously are even more important today. So I think that the advice we're giving our patients is sort of consistent with what we previously gave, or consistent with the advice that all of us in the world are, getting for dealing with COVID, but not that there's really something unique to the pediatric oncology patients otherwise.
Are you changing the number of people that are allowed to come to appointments with their children? Is that changed in any fashion?
Yeah, so this is also a very dynamic area where the recommendations are changing frequently. So I'm not sure that I can, tell you what the current one is, or whether it's the same at every center. But in global terms, for sure, we are being more restrictive than we would be under normal circumstances about visitors, about the number of people who can be with a patient who needs to be at the hospital, for their safety and for the safety of the other patients as well.
And what about from the provider standpoint? How is this changing what you're doing to stay safe? And we see several articles of doctors that are being diagnosed, unfortunately, and that are in patient care. I mean, how is this impacting what you're doing when you are in the clinic?
Yeah, of course it's true that the medical staff are being exposed to patients, and that there is some risk associated with that. On the other hand, we're being exposed kind of in the most controlled circumstances possible, in that we're super cognizant of these issues, and we do have, the ability to do social distancing and, put people in isolation and things like that, and wear protective equipment. That's not possible for people working in a grocery store or, in another environment. So I think, that the morale is good. I mean, people are realistic about what they're dealing with, but I think that people feel reasonably, that it's a reasonably controlled circumstance. At least, it's the best that it can be.
Got it. And that's obviously a concern as this goes on. The exposure that everybody's having, continues to go on as well. So, from the standpoint of treatment continuity, making sure that all of you on the front line are safe and protected and able to continue doing your job is significant. Is there anything that we can do in the childhood cancer community to help you all?
Well, I appreciate your kind words and your support. I don't know that I have really a concrete answer, except to say what's, I'm sure, obvious, that if anybody in the audience is the parent of a child undergoing care, all of this demands good teamwork from the families and the medical providers' perspective. So I think that if you have family contacts who are unwell or your child is unwell, of course, please call us prior to arriving at the hospital. Let us know what your concerns are so we can do everything we can to maximize your safety and the safety of others.
Going back to the earlier part of our discussion in terms of concerns over accessing therapies and continuity, are there any concerns over drug availability?
So, to the best of my knowledge, that has not become an issue so far. I'm sure even in the best of situations, there have been temporary drug shortages because of manufacturing problems and things like that. But I am not personally familiar that there's been a new issue with drug availability due to the COVID issue. Hopefully, of course, it'll stay that way.
Yeah. Obviously in good times, there's always issues that arise in terms of drug availability. So, that's obviously something that I think a number of us are concerned about. But, from what I've seen and what I've read in terms of how drug manufacturers and the FDA, how everybody's coming together and removing IP issues and removing licensing issues in some respects, it seems like everybody is really on the same page and wants to make sure that everybody is able to access their therapies and treatments and keep moving forward. So, it's good to hear. We're coming up on the end here. We've taken a question, and if anybody else has any other questions, please feel free to share them now. Again, the real reason why I wanted to have this conversation with you today was hopefully to provide some reassurance to the community, and especially to parents and caregivers who have a child in active treatment right now, as it is a very anxious time. Hopefully the takeaway from our conversation today is that, understanding the fluid nature of the situation and understanding some of the complexities surrounding it, the consortiums and institutions are working as hard as possible to make sure that children are able to maintain treatment continuity, that they're able to access, telemedicine and via email and conversations with their providers so that they don't have to come in for unnecessary visits and expose themselves. And clinical trials are still being planned and moving forward. And, it's an abnormal situation, but it sounds like everybody behind the scenes is really working to achieve as much normalcy as possible.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary. And, obviously I don't want to sound Pollyannish and, be dismissing concerns people have, but I really do think it's realistic and accurate to say that the medical staff, the hospitals, the pharmaceutical companies, the government, NCI, FDA, that really everybody is working together to try to minimize impact on the patients and their families. And I think it's been an effective response so far.
Good. I think that's the most reassuring thing that people can take away. And also, for me, it's in this type of situation where, we really don't know how long we're going to have to, be in this lockdown or be in this situation. You know, it sounds like the communication lines are constant. Sounds like everybody is trying to move along fluidly. You know, the number of articles I've read and some of the chatter on the social media boards about parents being concerned about accessing treatments and you know, parents from international families that are concerned about whether or not they'll still be able to travel. You know, it just sounds like everybody is working to make sure that that doesn't happen, but you know, we just have to stay tuned. So, well, if there are no more questions, you know, I appreciate your time, appreciate all you're doing. You know, if there's any way that we in the community can support efforts to make sure that, you know, you are safe on the front lines, that the nursing staff are safe, that the research is continuing, and that's obviously another big concern I have running a nonprofit, is the ability to continue to fund research, raise funds to support research efforts. You know, we're all in this together trying to figure things out. And so, you know, whatever we can do, you know, we're happy to do. So truly appreciate it.
Well, thank you for your kind words. I'm sure I can speak for my colleagues, you know, at Memorial and elsewhere, that we really appreciate your concern, the community's concern. And, you know, we'll continue to do everything we can to help the children, their families get through this.
Thank you. Appreciate it. If you want to learn more about MaxCure, you can go to maxcure.org to see our programs. One of the programs that we have is called the War Beyond Barriers program, where we provide financial support to low-income military and first responder families. And they're being hit particularly hard at this point in time. You know, issues of being able to afford travel, issues of being able to afford to live at this point are you know, ramping up. So, you know, any support that we can receive is greatly appreciated. Dr. Dunkel, thank you for your time. Thank you for your candid answers and for this conversation. And thank you for everything that you're doing to make sure that the community keeps moving forward and gaining access to treatments, and new therapies are being developed.
Well, thank you for having me, and I enjoyed the conversation, Jonathan.
Appreciate it.
All right.
Thank you, everyone.